Fate Samurai Remnant has really took me by surprise. I should probably start by saying that I'm not really much of a Fate fan. I watched and enjoyed Fate Zero, and I've played a bit of Melty Blood, but other than that, I've bounced off pretty much everything Fate related, even if I think that certain individual parts of them are pretty cool. And while I am fond of Musou games, I'm not crazy about them, so when a new Fate game was announced being designed by the Dynasty Warriors team, my initial reaction was, oh, so we're getting another one, eh? That's cool, I guess. However, as we got closer to the release, I did start to notice that Samurai Remnant wasn't your typical formulaic Musou title, which is especially appreciated since, I mean, the series has already kind of had two of these already, so a single-player action-adventure styled RPG similar to what they did with Persona 5 Strikers is quite a nice change of pace. The setup for Samurai Remnant is pretty by-the-numbers Fate, with the plot centering around something called the Waxing Moon Ritual, a variant on the typical Holy Grail war that occurs in the main visual novel. This event is essentially a battle royale tournament where 7 mages will all summon their own mythological or historical icon known as servants to help them win, with each one belonging to their own unique RPG-style class, with the protagonist being with the sword-wielding Saber. The main difference that the Waxing Moon ritual has is that it also summons 8 rogue heroic spirits that belong to no master. Our protagonist is Miyamoto Iori, adopted son of the real-life samurai Miyamoto Musashi, who was famous for dual-wielding katana. Yes, he is the one that inspired all of those character designs. But the plot takes place a few months after his father's death, before he was able to pass down all of his knowledge from his signature style. Since then, Iori has been training alone, and has even taught himself a single fireball spell from a magic talking book that he has, which technically makes him a mage, and thus means he's eligible for the Waxing Moon ritual. So he ends up summoning his own heroic spirit, which for spoiler reasons we'll just call Saber, and naturally the two of them have to work together. On the surface, Iori is a bit of a cookie-cutter protagonist with the whole angsty look and aimless motives thing going on, but while I think he's certainly a little bit generic, I actually think he's characterized very well, and I really like him even if he's not really doing anything I haven't seen before. And I think part of that is due to the dynamic that he has with Saber. In contrast to Iori, Saber is a very expressive character. She's cool-headed most of the time, but very enthusiastic to the new world she's woken up in, and she's incredibly arrogant, but has the skills to back that up. But most importantly, at least for me, is that she's pretty snarky, and I think ultimately the dynamic between her and Iori is what makes me like the two of them so much. They play off each other in some really fun ways, and together they're a lot more than the sum of their individual parts, which is something that does carry over to their gameplay as well. Now, I'm gonna be frank with you, the core moment-to-moment combat is probably the weakest aspect of the game. I mean, it is a Musou game with Musou combat, so attacks kind of feel weightless most of the time, and individuals or even groups of enemies don't really pose much of a threat. However, this is where I think Omega Force has kind of found an area where the downsides of their combat don't really pose much of a problem. Musou combat outside of your typical boss fights has the problem, if you see it as one, as being a little brain dead, and when playing your typical Musou title, the game's gameplay is more about managing a battlefield with your ultimate problem solver character than it is actually learning how to hack and slash good. And the thing that really drags down this subgenre for the average player is that when you're doing nothing but pressing the XXX and the YYY for 15 plus minutes at a time, it gets really tiring really quickly.
XX and YYY and XX and YYY again, you'll be sucked.
However, Fate Samurai Remnant, like Persona 5 Strikers before it, for the most part completely centers around having small, brief skirmishes that are all over in less than a minute or so, and because of this, 1, it doesn't ever get too monotonous, and 2, it lowers the average enemy count, which results in enemies that actually do fight you and are a bit more aggressive. And this style of combat is really complemented by, instead of having big, long, drawn-out fights, of having these small little confrontations that act as little pace breakers while you're running around town completing side quests and finding little MacGuffins to upgrade your characters with. And in a lot of ways, it means that it ends up feeling a lot like a Yakuza title for me. In fact, it's got pretty much the same setting as Yakuza Kenzan, to the point where I can actually recognize some of these areas as, I think, being the same. I imagine they're probably based off of some old painting or map of the area. This all being said, there are a few moments where the game's combat actually does get to spread its wings a bit and gain a little bit of depth, and that's during the boss and mini-boss fights. This mainly revolves around baiting out attacks and doing some damage while the enemy's recovering, and also preemptively countering with various special skills when an enemy goes for a big glowing red attack. And for certain bosses, you'll need to whittle down a shield meter at opportune moments before Iori can even start doing damage, or even attack freely without clanking off of them. It's a really simple system, as I said, but it still does its job, and it's fun enjoying the various spectacles of some of the boss moves. What really helps keep things fresh amongst all of this, though, is Iori's ability to swap combat styles, another thing that's a bit like Yakuza, with him having 5 in total. Water, his dual-wielding general use style that has a lot of big hitboxes and the ability to knock enemies down easy. Earth, a single sword defensive style that gives Iori a shield that will drain before his health and then recharge once it's broken. Wind, a style that uses a sword and magic in tandem for some high damaging combo finishes, but is restricted by a sort of stamina magic bar. Fire, where Iori uses dual-wielded fire-infused swords for a high-risk, high-reward gameplay style where the lower your health is, the more damage you deal. And finally Void, a gameplay style that lets you become Virgil from Devil May Cry, a really powerful style which attacks get faster the more health you have. Now, they do obviously have their different benefits and strengths, but realistically, any of them will work in most situations, so for the most part you can kind of just go nuts and either keep using your favorite style all the time, or mix it up a bit to keep things interesting. The thing that I think really elevates the gameplay though is the character progression, which is something that Omega Force have always been pretty good at, with a ton of ways to upgrade your characters through it, be leveling up, spending points on a skill tree, upgrading your workshop with various materials to gain passive effects, or just changing your equipment in the form of mountings for Iori's swords. There's a good chunk of ways to power up your character, and for the most part they all feel very significant. And this is an aspect of the game I really love, because while for the most part you do only play as Iori, you are able to tag in Saber or various other servants who you are working with at set moments in the story to lay in the damage, since narratively these characters are really powerful, and they really show that by when you're using them, they feel like your typical OP Muso character where you can absolutely tear up shop. What I really like about this though is Iori is mainly a sword user, so he can't really play the typical role that a master does in this setting of being support. For the most part, he's just a normal dude who's pretty good with a sword and knows a very limited amount of magic. And Saber takes quite a few jabs at him throughout the story, talking about how weak he is and how he really shouldn't be fighting on the front line. And this shows in just how subdued a lot of his abilities are in comparison to these servant characters. What I like about this is there's a little bit of ludo-narrative harmony going on here, since Iori makes up for his lack of raw power by leaning in on his versatility, whereas the heroic spirits' skill trees are mainly comprised of just stat boosts to make them stronger. There are a few new things here and there, especially on Saber, but they are just kind of there to make them stronger. Iori, on the other hand, has a much bigger skill tree for starters, and also has a lot of things like new spells that he can learn and new team attacks that he can do. But he can also upgrade those subdued movesets that he has, with various upgrades like this certain combo finisher and water style being able to be done repeatedly by mashing, or this certain combo finisher in earth style being able to absorb enemy attacks attacks and gets stronger the more damage it absorbs. And through stuff like this and the workshop and the equipment system that only Iori has, he's able to close that distance in raw strength even if he never quite actually gets up to those levels. And this is only further enhanced by the fact that Saber starts 15 levels above Iori, meaning that he physically, just stat-wise, needs to catch up as well. One final part of the gameplay is there is this sort of board game-like sequence at certain points in the story that you need to go through, which kind of remind me of the single-player mode in Final Fantasy Distia and the story mode in Dragon Ball Budokai 2. I'd really like to say that these are good, because I like the idea of them, of you strategically having to move around the map and then getting into small skirmishes when you bump into enemies, but sadly they kind of drip-feed new mechanics into it, and it means that the majority of them are tutorialized and you're kind of restricted and forced to go down a certain path with a lot of them. So not only are you limited with a lot of the special abilities and stuff that you can do with them, but they're also kind of rigged in your favor and you can't really lose because you only have one option to do most of the time. Now, one last thing I want to talk about for this quick look review kind of thing is the presentation. Starting with the one bad thing I have to say is I'm not terribly impressed with the PS5 port. It goes down the same route a lot of Japanese games do that are cross-platform, where it's just the same as the PS4 game at a higher resolution. Which, I mean, for the most part, it would be fine, and it is fine for the most part. This is just me being nitpicky, but when you look at the PC version, and there's lots of options for higher scalable things like better render distances or higher shadow quality or various other stuff like that. And the PS5 version could be taking advantage of all of this, and it just doesn't. It's just wasted potential and a little bit disappointed. But besides all of that, I really like the general look and aesthetic of Samurai Remnant. The areas are quite varied for a game that takes place entirely in one city, and while the NPCs aren't amazing looking, the main character models are pretty good, and the fancy cutscenes where they really pull out all of the stops with the animation are very nice. The thing that I really enjoy though is the character portraits. These are really nice bits of art, and it's just nice seeing Fate stuff that doesn't look all the same. In fact, huge props to the artist and character designer for this game, Rei Wataru, because firstly, they did a really good job with all of this art. I love it, it's very expressive, it's fun, and it's really stylized. But they were actually brought in to work on this after working on a manga adaptation of a certain event that happened in the Fate Go gacha mobile game, and after reading a little bit of it, I can say that they bloody knocked it out of the park with that as well. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because that manga does technically act as a prequel to this game. It's pretty much the only connection that Fate Samurai Remnant has to the other Fate properties, but it's actually quite amusing as to how it does exactly. You see, even though Iori's father, Miyamoto Musashi, has only just died, he does technically qualify as a heroic spirit. But Fate, being Fate, had to Nasu-verse his ass, so naturally he looks like this. Cause don't worry guys, this is actually a Miyamoto Musashi from a different dimension where he was a woman. And her reactions with Iori are a little weird since she has one as well in her dimension, so he kind of recognizes her as his father, but also is like knowing that she's a different person. Typical anime bullshit, but you know, it's fun and she's got a cute design, so I let it pass. But yeah, this manga for this Fate Go event is actually kinda all about this version of Miyamoto Musashi and her dimension hopping about everywhere. So while it's not essential to understand Fate Samurai Remnant, since it doesn't really come up much, there's just a couple of leading lines about it. If you really want to know about this specific version of this character, you do technically have a prequel manga that you can read through. It has ultimately been on hiatus for a little bit, presumably because the artist was working on this instead of being able to work on the manga. And if you do want to read it, unfortunately in English it's only available digitally, which is kind of annoying since if I am gonna get a manga, I want a physical book that I can put on my bookcase and display how much of a fucking loser I am. But yeah, overall, I've really been enjoying Fate Samurai Remnant, and I'm really looking forward to finishing it up, and also getting to the New Game Plus that I hear is really good, which doesn't surprise me, because Omega Force does some really good stuff for New Game Plus, or post-game content, or whatever you want to call it. And I definitely recommend it to people, even if you're not necessarily a fan of the Fate series. It's one of the few times that you can just play a Fate game without having to worry about playing visual novels or doing whatever. But yeah, it's got pretty okay combat, it's got fun characters, and it's got a good story, so definitely keep an eye on it for in case it goes pretty low on a sale or something. Now, if you excuse me, I'm going to go giggle to myself about how these two images are the same person.